January 17, 1945. The Ardennes forest, Belgium. The snow fell in silence. Thick, relentless. It buried the roads, the foxholes, the bodies of men whose names would not be known for weeks. In the shadow of shattered pines, a German grenadier crouched low, his breath crystallizing in the frozen air. His hands, blackened by frostbite, clutched a rifle he could barely feel. He had not eaten in 3 days. His stomach had stopped protesting. It had given up, like so many things in the final winter of the Third Reich. Across a ravine choked with ice and shrapnel, he saw them, American soldiers. They moved with a strange casualness, even here, even now, in the dying light of a battle that had already consumed tens of thousands. One of them sat on the edge of a half-destroyed bunker, unwrapping something small and brown. Chocolate. The German watched, his lips cracked and bleeding, as the American broke off a piece and ate it slowly, deliberately, as if the war had paused for him alone. The grenadier had been told many things about the Americans. That they were soft, that they could not endure hardship, that their wealth had made them weak, their democracy a charade of discipline. He had believed it once, in the summer of 1944, when the Wehrmacht still held France and the Führer still spoke of wonder weapons and final victories. But here, in the frozen hell of the Ardennes, watching that American eat chocolate while his own body consumed itself, he understood something his commanders had never taught him. Abundance was not weakness. It was power, and the Americans had brought it to war. The chocolate bar that German soldier saw was not an indulgence. It was a weapon. The U.S. Army called it the D-Ration, a 4-ounce block of chocolate, oats, and sugar, fortified with vitamins, designed to sustain a soldier in the field when nothing else could. It was born not from luxury, but from necessity, from the cold logic of a nation that understood war on an industrial scale. In 1937, years before the first American soldier set foot in Europe, Colonel Paul Logan of the U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps approached the Hershey Chocolate Company with a problem. How do you feed an army that might fight anywhere, in any climate, under any conditions? The solution had to be portable, durable, and nutritious. It had to survive desert heat and Arctic cold. It had to taste good enough to eat, but not so good that soldiers would devour their emergency rations in moments of boredom. Hershey's chemists worked for months. They tested formulas in ovens and freezers, in humidity chambers and high-altitude simulations. They added oat flour to prevent melting. They reduced the sugar just enough to make the bar palatable, but not irresistible. By 1941, they had their answer, a dense, bitter block of chocolate that could withstand temperatures up to 120 degrees Fahrenheit, that provided 600 calories of energy, that could keep a man alive when everything else had failed. The U.S. military ordered millions. By the time the first American troops landed in North Africa in 1942, every soldier carried at least 3 D-rations in his pack. They were issued alongside ammunition and morphine, tools of survival in a war that would test the limits of human endurance. The Germans saw the chocolate. They did not see the system behind it. They did not see the factories in Pennsylvania churning out 500,000 bars a day. They did not see the supply ships crossing the Atlantic in convoys so vast they stretched beyond the horizon. They did not see the trucks and trains and cargo planes that carried those bars from Hershey to the front lines, that delivered them to soldiers in the jungles of Guadalcanal and the ruins of Cassino and the frozen fields of Belgium. They saw only the surface, American soldiers eating candy in the middle of a war. And they laughed. In the autumn of 1944, German intelligence officers compiled reports on American military logistics. They were meticulous, precise, the kind of documentation that had once made the Wehrmacht the most feared fighting force in Europe. They noted the tonnage of supplies flowing into France. They cataloged the vehicles, the fuel depots, the ammunition dumps. They observed the Americans eating not just chocolate, but canned fruit, powdered milk, coffee with real sugar. One report, filed by a Hauptmann in the 2nd Panzer Division, described the contents of a captured American supply truck, 1,200 pounds of rations, including meat, cheese, and dessert. Dessert. In a war zone. The Hauptmann wrote, "The enemy fights not as soldiers but as tourists. They bring their comforts with them. They do not know hunger. They do not know sacrifice." His words were circulated among German officers, read aloud in briefings, used as evidence of American decadence. The logic was seductive. A nation that pampered its soldiers could not produce warriors. A nation that ate chocolate in foxholes could not endure the brutal arithmetic of total war. The Germans had been taught to see hardship as a virtue, deprivation as proof of ideological purity. They wore their suffering like a medal. They believed it made them stronger. But belief and reality are not the same thing. In December 1944, when the Wehrmacht launched its final great offensive in the West, the operation the Allies would call the Battle of the Bulge, the German soldiers who crossed into Belgium carried rations for 3 days. Their supply lines, already stretched thin by years of attrition, could barely keep pace with the advance. The plan was simple: move fast, capture American supply depots, use enemy resources to sustain the offensive. It was a gamble built on desperation, on the assumption that the Americans, caught off guard and overwhelmed, would abandon their supplies in retreat. They did not retreat. They held. And the Germans, advancing into the snow-covered forests, found themselves cut off, encircled, starving. By the 3rd week of December, the grenadiers of the 12th SS Panzer Division were eating their horses. Orders had been given to prioritize ammunition over food. The logic was clear: dead men do not need rations. The soldiers boiled horse meat in their helmets, mixed it with snow to stretch the portions. Some chewed on tree bark. Others dug through frozen garbage pits, searching for scraps the Americans had discarded. They found cans of peaches, tins of Spam, wrappers from D-Rations. The wrappers still smelled faintly of chocolate. One German officer, a lieutenant named Hans Schmidt, later described the moment he realized the war was over. It was not in combat. It was not in the face of an enemy advance. It was in a captured American foxhole where he found, stacked neatly beside a pile of ammunition, 6 chocolate bars for cans of coffee and a carton of cigarettes. He stared at them for a long time. He had not seen coffee in months. His men were eating roots. And here, in the middle of a battlefield, the Americans had left behind enough food to feed a squad for days. They had left it because they knew more was coming. Because their supply lines were so robust, so overwhelming, that abundance was assumed. Schmidt took the chocolate. He ate it slowly, mechanically. It tasted like defeat. The Americans, meanwhile, did not think of their rations as symbols. They thought of them as necessities. Sergeant John Finnegan of the 101st Airborne, dug in outside Bastogne, later recalled the moment he shared his last D-Ration with a Belgian child. The town was surrounded. The Germans had cut off all roads. Supplies were being dropped by parachute, but the weather was so bad that planes could barely fly. Finnegan and his men had been eating 1 meal a day, sometimes less. They were cold. They were tired. They were holding a position they knew might become their grave. But they had chocolate. And when the child appeared, thin and trembling, eyes wide with hunger, Finnegan did not hesitate. He broke the bar in half and handed it over. The child ate in silence, tears streaming down frozen cheeks. Finnegan later wrote in a letter home, "I gave that kid my ration because I knew I'd get another one." That's the difference. We knew the system wouldn't let us down. The Germans didn't have that. They were fighting on hope. We were fighting on logistics. Logistics. The word is cold, technical, unglamorous. It does not stir the heart the way courage or sacrifice does. But wars are not won by courage alone. They are won by the ability to keep men fed, armed, and moving forward when every instinct tells them to stop. The United States understood this in a way no other nation did. It was not an accident. It was not luck. It was the product of a system built over decades, refined through trial and error, implemented with ruthless efficiency. Before the war, the U.S. military had studied Napoleon's campaigns, the trench warfare of World War I, the rapid mechanized movements of the early Blitzkrieg. They had learned one lesson above all: an army that cannot eat cannot fight. They had seen what happened to the Germans in Russia, watched as the Wehrmacht's supply lines collapsed under the weight of distance and winter. They had seen the Japanese in the Pacific, cut off from their home islands, reduced to starvation and disease. The Americans decided they would never make the same mistake. They built a supply network that spanned oceans. They produced more food than their army could possibly consume, then shipped the surplus to their allies. By 1944, the U.S. was feeding not just its own soldiers, but British troops, Free French forces, Soviet partisans, and millions of civilians in liberated territories. They did this while maintaining a standard of nutrition higher than most soldiers had known in peacetime. The average American soldier consumed 4,000 calories a day. The average German soldier by 1945 was lucky to get 1,500. The chocolate bar was a small part of this system, but it was emblematic of the whole. It represented a philosophy: take care of your soldiers, and they will take care of the mission. Feed them well, and they will fight well. Show them that their nation values their lives, and they will risk those lives when it matters. The Germans had been taught to see sacrifice as an end in itself. The Americans saw it as something to be minimized, a cost to be paid only when necessary. It was a fundamental difference in worldview, and it shaped everything. In the spring of 1945, as the war in Europe entered its final weeks, Allied forces advanced into Germany itself. They liberated concentration camps. They liberated prisoner-of-war camps. They liberated towns and cities where civilians had been living on rations so meager that children had forgotten the taste of meat. American soldiers moving through these places gave away their D-rations by the thousands. They handed them to skeletal prisoners, to German civilians too stunned to understand what was happening, to children who had never seen chocolate before. One soldier, Private Robert Klein, later described entering a liberated camp near Dachau. The prisoners mobbed the American trucks, begging for food. Klein and his platoon had orders not to give them too much. After prolonged starvation, a full meal could kill. So they handed out chocolate bars one at a time and watched as men and women wept over a few ounces of sweetness. Klein wrote, "They looked at us like we were gods. We weren't gods. We were just guys with a good supply sergeant." The Germans, watching from the ruins of their cities, understood then what they had refused to believe before. The Americans had not won because they were harder or braver or more ideologically pure. They had won because they had more. More food, more fuel, more steel, more everything. The Third Reich had built its empire on the mythology of strength through suffering. The United States had built its power on the reality of abundance through organization. There is a photograph, taken in May 1945, that captures this moment. It shows a group of German prisoners of war, newly captured, being processed by American soldiers. One of the Americans is handing out rations. The Germans stare at the packages with expressions that mix disbelief and shame. They had been told their enemy was weak, decadent, incapable of endurance. They had believed it even as their own rations dwindled, even as their cities burned, even as the front collapsed around them. Now they stood in a line, waiting to be fed by the nation they had been taught to despise. But the story of the chocolate bar does not end with the Germans. It does not end in Europe at all. In the Pacific, where the war continued into August, American soldiers faced an enemy even more resistant to surrender, even more indoctrinated in the ideology of sacrifice. The Japanese military had taken the German philosophy of hardship as virtue and elevated it to a religious principle. Japanese soldiers were expected to fight to the death. They were expected to survive on handfuls of rice. They were expected to view surrender as the ultimate dishonor. When American forces captured Japanese positions, they found supply situations that defied comprehension. On islands like Iwo Jima and Okinawa, Japanese soldiers had been cut off for months. They ate grass, seaweed, insects. Some resorted to cannibalism. Their officers, even as their men starved, refused to surrender or retreat. They believed that suffering ennobled the spirit, that privation proved loyalty to the emperor. It was a worldview that could not coexist with American logistics. American soldiers, advancing through these islands, carried their D-rations and their K-rations and their 10-in-1 field rations. They ate hot meals whenever possible, prepared in mobile kitchens that followed the front lines. They drank coffee. They smoked cigarettes. They wrote letters home on paper provided by the military, sealed them in envelopes provided by the military, and mailed them through a postal system that functioned even in the midst of battle. The Japanese watched from their caves and bunkers, watched as the Americans built their supply depots and mess tents and field hospitals, and could not reconcile what they saw with what they had been taught. One Japanese officer, Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka, surrendered in August 1945 after the atomic bombs fell and the emperor's voice crackled over the radio, ordering his soldiers to lay down their arms. Tanaka later described his first encounter with American forces. He was taken to a POW camp. He was given a medical examination. He was fed. The meal included meat, bread, and a chocolate bar. Tanaka stared at the chocolate for a long time. He had not eaten chocolate since before the war. He had forgotten what it tasted like. When he finally ate it, he said he felt a grief he could not explain. Not because the chocolate was good, though it was, but because it represented everything his nation had lacked. Everything his leaders had told him did not matter. He wrote in his memoir, published decades later, "We were told that spirit could defeat materialism. We were told that our willingness to die made us superior. But you cannot fight a war on spirit alone. You cannot win when your soldiers are starving and the enemy is eating chocolate." The D-Ration was discontinued in 1945, replaced by new formulations, new technologies, new understandings of nutrition, and field logistics. But its legacy endured. The chocolate bar became a symbol, not just of American abundance, but of a different way of thinking about power. It represented the idea that strength comes not from the ability to endure suffering, but from the ability to eliminate it. That the purpose of a military is not to test the limits of human endurance, but to protect the lives of those who serve. In the decades after the war, as historians sifted through the records and interviewed the survivors, the story of the D-Ration emerged as a microcosm of a larger truth. The Second World War was not won by any single battle or strategy. It was won by systems, by factories and supply chains and logistics networks, by the unglamorous work of quartermasters and supply sergeants and the engineers who designed railways and the sailors who crewed cargo ships. It was won by a nation that understood, perhaps better than any other, that war is not an art. It is a science, and the side with the better science wins. The chocolate bar was a small thing, 4 ounces, wrapped in foil, carried in a pocket, but it represented something much larger, the idea that a democracy, with all its inefficiencies and debates and messy compromises, could produce a war machine more powerful than any dictatorship. Because democracies do not waste lives needlessly. They value the individual. They build systems designed to bring their soldiers home. And that value, that care, translates into strength. There is a monument in Belgium, near the town of Bastogne, where the 101st Airborne held their line during the coldest winter of the war. It is a simple stone marker, engraved with the names of the fallen. Visitors leave flowers there. Sometimes they leave other things, coins, letters, photographs. And sometimes in the winter, when the snow falls as it did in 1945, someone leaves a chocolate bar. It sits there in the cold, a small offering to men who fought not because they loved war, but because they loved the world they came from, a world where children ate chocolate and no one went hungry, where abundance was a right and not a privilege, where strength was measured not by the ability to suffer, but by the ability to care for others. The German soldier who crouched in the snow that January day did not survive the war. His name is not recorded. His story is one of millions lost in the vast machinery of history. But his realization, that moment when he watched the American eat chocolate and understood that his side had already lost, was replicated 1,000 times in 1,000 different places by 1,000 different men who had been taught to despise what they should have admired. The Americans did not win because they were invincible. They won because they were fed. Because they had chocolate in their pockets and coffee in their canteens, and the absolute certainty that somewhere behind them, across an ocean or over a mountain range, there was a system working tirelessly to keep them alive. That certainty gave them courage. It gave them endurance. It gave them the ability to fight not with desperation, but with confidence. And in the end, confidence, backed by resources, by organization, by a nation that valued its soldiers enough to feed them well, proved stronger than any ideology built on sacrifice. The snow still falls in the Ardennes. The forests have grown back. The foxholes have filled with earth and leaves. But the lesson remains, carved into history like names on a monument. Wars are not won by those willing to suffer the most. They are won by those who understand that suffering is not a virtue. It is a problem, and problems have solutions. The chocolate bar was one solution. Small, simple, unglamorous. But in the frozen hands of a soldier who had been told he was expendable, who had been taught that hardship was noble and abundance was weak, that small brown square represented a truth more powerful than propaganda, that a nation rich enough to give its soldiers chocolate was a nation strong enough to win, and that in the contest between ideology and logistics, between myth and material, between the romance of sacrifice and the reality of supply chains, the side with chocolate would always, in the end, prevail.